when 847 Marines found themselves surrounded by enemy forces in the mountains of Eastern Europe. Every conventional escape route had been cut off. The brass said it was impossible. Too many hostiles, too much firepower, too risky for any pilot to attempt. But Blair Thompson, a 26-year-old Apache helicopter pilot who'd been grounded from combat missions for being too emotional and lacking the killer instinct, was about to prove that sometimes the most underestimated warrior becomes the most dangerous. What she did next didn't just save nearly 1,000 lives, it rewrote the military's understanding of what courage really looks like. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ramstein Air Base in Germany as Blair Thompson completed her third consecutive week of aircraft maintenance duty. At 0600 hours, while her male counterparts were suiting up for combat missions over the contested regions of Eastern Europe, Blair found herself once again inspecting rotor blades and checking hydraulic systems on grounded Apache helicopters. Blair stood barely 5'4" with auburn hair pulled back in regulation style, her green eyes holding an intensity that seemed too fierce for her delicate features. At 26, she was one of the youngest Apache pilots ever certified, but also one of the most sidelined. Her colleagues at Ramstein had given her the call sign Nightingale, supposedly for her precise flying, but Blair knew the real reason. They saw her as too soft, too caring, too emotionally invested in every mission briefing where casualties were discussed. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd graduated top of her class from flight school, could thread an Apache through mountain passes that gave seasoned pilots nightmares, and had logged more simulator hours than any pilot in her squadron. But every time a real combat mission arose, she found herself assigned to base security, transport runs, or maintenance supervision. "Thompson," called out Major Frank Harrison, her commanding officer, as he approached the hangar. Harrison was a bear of a man, with graying temples and a voice that carried the authority of 2 decades in combat aviation. "I need you to run a supply mission to Forward Operating Base Glacier today, medical supplies and ammunition for the advance teams." Blair nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the familiar sting of disappointment. "Yes, sir. What's the cargo weight and destination coordinates?" "Standard transport load. You'll be taking Black Hawk 772, not an Apache. The attack birds are reserved for pilots who can handle the pressure of real combat." Harrison's words carried the casual dismissal that Blair had grown accustomed to, but they still cut deep. Forward Operating Base Glacier sat nestled in the mountains of Montenegro, a strategic position that served as a staging point for operations deeper into hostile territory. It was important work, Blair knew, but it wasn't combat. It wasn't the reason she'd spent 5 years training to be one of the most lethal pilots in the sky. The other pilots in her squadron, Jackson Viper Morrison, Derek Tang Chen, and Marcus Thunder Rodriguez, were currently suiting up for their second combat sortie of the week. She watched them through the hangar window, noting the easy confidence in their movements, the way they joked and checked each other's equipment. They were heading to provide close air support for a Marine reconnaissance unit that had encountered heavy resistance near the Albanian border. "Wish we could take Thompson with us," she heard Chen say as the group passed by her workstation. "Yeah, but you know command's position," Morrison replied, lowering his voice but not enough that Blair couldn't hear. "They're worried she'll freeze up when it comes time to pull the trigger. All that emotion, it's a liability in combat." Rodriguez shook his head. "I've seen her in training. She's got better reflexes than any of us and can put ordnance on target with surgical precision. The emotional thing is bullshit." "Maybe," Morrison shrugged, "but until she proves she can handle the heat, she stays on the bench." Blair's hands tightened around the wrench she was holding. The emotional label had followed her throughout her career, born from a single incident during advanced training where she'd shown visible distress during a briefing about civilian casualties in a recent operation. Her instructors had noted her excessive emotional response to mission parameters, and the stigma had stuck like glue. What they didn't understand was that her emotional investment made her better, not worse. She studied every mission profile with obsessive detail, memorized casualty statistics to understand the human cost of every tactical decision, and approached every training exercise with the weight of real lives in mind. Her precision in flight simulations wasn't despite her emotions, it was because of them. The supply run to Forward Operating Base Glacier would take 4 hours round trip, threading between mountain peaks and navigating weather systems that could change from clear skies to zero visibility in minutes. It was routine work for someone of her skill level, but it was also the only flying she was allowed to do. As she walked toward the Black Hawk, she caught sight of the Apache helicopters lined up on the far side of the tarmac. AH-64E Guardians, each one carrying enough firepower to level a city block, equipped with 30mm chain guns, Hellfire missiles, and advanced targeting systems that could track and eliminate threats from miles away. She knew every system, every capability, every tactical application for those machines. Someday, she promised herself, she'd prove that being emotionally invested in the mission didn't make her weak. It made her the most dangerous pilot they never gave a chance to fly. The flight to FOB Glacier took Blair over terrain that never failed to take her breath away. The Dinaric Alps stretched beneath her Black Hawk like a geological masterpiece, their snow-capped peaks gleaming in the morning sun. But today, the beauty was overshadowed by the radio chatter filling her headset, reports of increased enemy activity, reconnaissance teams encountering heavier resistance than expected, and a growing sense that something big was building in the contested regions. Blair had memorized every valley, every peak, every potential landing zone within a 200-mile radius of Ramstein. It was information that went far beyond what was required for simple transport missions, but she couldn't help herself. Understanding the battlefield wasn't just professional curiosity. It was an obsession born from knowing that someday someone's life might depend on her knowledge. As she approached FOB Glacier, the radio crackled with an update that made her stomach tighten. All units, be advised, Marine Recon Team Delta has encountered heavy resistance in Grid Square 742. They're requesting immediate close air support. Blair knew Grid Square 742 intimately. It was a narrow valley system, approximately 40 miles northeast of her current position, surrounded by ridgelines that provided excellent cover for anti-aircraft positions. The terrain was a nightmare for helicopter operations. Too many places for enemy forces to hide, too few escape routes if things went wrong. She landed at FOB Glacier and began the routine process of unloading medical supplies and ammunition. The base buzzed with activity as personnel prepared for what everyone sensed was going to be a significant escalation in combat operations. Blair caught fragments of conversation between officers that painted a troubling picture. "Delta team's been dark for 3 hours," she heard Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell tell her operations officer. "Last contact reported heavy machine gun fire from multiple positions. They're pinned down and taking casualties." Blair's hands moved automatically through the supply checklist, but her mind was entirely focused on the tactical situation developing to the northeast. She'd studied the terrain around Grid Square 742 extensively, knew the elevation changes, the wind patterns, the sight lines that enemy forces would use to maximum advantage. After completing the supply delivery, Blair approached Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell. "Ma'am, I couldn't help but overhear about Delta Team. I know that area well from my transport runs. If you need additional reconnaissance or—" "Thompson," Mitchell interrupted, her voice carrying the familiar tone of polite dismissal. "I appreciate your concern, but we have combat-qualified pilots handling the situation. Your job is to get those supplies back to Ramstein safely." The words stung, but Blair pressed on. "Yes, ma'am, but I've flown over that terrain dozens of times. I know the wind patterns, the elevation changes, the sight lines that enemy forces would use to maximum advantage." "Thompson," Mitchell's voice grew firmer, "I'm not questioning your knowledge of the terrain, but combat support missions require a different mindset than transport operations. They require pilots who can pull the trigger when pulling the trigger means ending someone's life. Command has concerns about whether you can cross that line when it matters."
The conversation was interrupted by an urgent radio transmission that made everyone in the command tent freeze. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper Lead. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Falcon is hit. I repeat, Falcon is hit. We're pulling back to regroup." Blair's blood turned cold. That was Morrison's voice, and Falcon was Derek Chen's call sign. The close air support mission for Delta Team had gone wrong, and now her squadron mates were in trouble. "How bad?" Mitchell demanded, keying her radio. "Falcon took an RPG to the tail rotor. He's auto-rotating to an emergency landing zone approximately 2 miles south of Delta Team's position. We're going to need immediate search and rescue." Blair felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Chen was down in hostile territory. Delta Team was still pinned down, and the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Every instinct she had screamed that this was going to get much worse before it got better. Mitchell was already coordinating the response, calling for additional aircraft and planning a complex rescue operation. But Blair knew something that no one else in that tent understood. She knew exactly where Chen had gone down, and she knew that the standard rescue approaches were going to fail. The terrain was too dangerous, the enemy presence too heavy, and time was running out.
The flight back to Ramstein should have been routine, but Blair's mind raced with tactical possibilities as she monitored the emergency frequencies. Chen's helicopter had gone down in a valley she knew intimately. Devil's Canyon, the pilots called it, a narrow gorge surrounded by ridgelines that provided perfect cover for enemy forces. The official rescue plan would take hours to coordinate, involving ground teams and complex air support that might arrive too late. Blair had spent countless off-duty hours studying the tactical applications of terrain in this region, not because it was required, but because she understood that knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. While her colleagues relaxed in the base recreation center, she pored over satellite imagery and weather data, memorizing sight lines, wind patterns, and potential approach routes that existed nowhere in official flight manuals. Her personal flight bag contained detailed topographical maps that she'd annotated with notes on seasonal wind variations, enemy position patterns observed during previous operations, and alternative landing zones that most pilots didn't know existed. She'd calculated approach angles that could minimize exposure to ground fire, identified terrain features that could provide cover during combat operations, and developed contingency plans for scenarios that Command had never asked her to consider. But perhaps most importantly, Blair had spent hundreds of hours in flight simulators running combat scenarios that pushed the limits of what Apache helicopters could accomplish. She'd programmed custom scenarios based on real intelligence reports, testing her ability to engage multiple targets while providing close air support in confined terrain. Her scores were consistently higher than any pilot in her squadron, but since they weren't part of official training requirements, nobody paid attention. As she landed at Ramstein, Blair immediately headed to the intelligence briefing room where updates on the developing situation were being coordinated. The picture emerging from Devil's Canyon was worse than anyone had initially realized. Chen's helicopter had gone down in the narrowest part of the valley, directly between Delta Team's position and their planned extraction route. Enemy forces had used the opportunity to reinforce their positions, effectively trapping both the downed pilot and the Marine reconnaissance team. Satellite imagery shows at least 12 heavy machine gun positions along the ridgelines. Anti-aircraft assets include multiple RPG teams and what appears to be at least 2 mobile SAM launchers. Any rescue attempt is going to face significant ground fire. Blair studied the tactical display, noting details that others seemed to miss. The enemy positions were concentrated on the northern and eastern ridgelines, following a defensive pattern she'd seen in previous intelligence reports. But there was a gap in their coverage along the western approach, a narrow corridor that could be exploited if someone knew exactly where to look. "What about approaching from the west?" she asked, pointing to the satellite image. "The ridgeline there appears to have lighter defensive coverage." Major Harrison turned toward her with barely concealed irritation. "Thompson, you're supposed to be filing your transport reports, not analyzing combat scenarios."
Yes, sir, but I noticed. What you noticed is irrelevant. Combat planning is for combat pilots. Your job is logistics. Captain Rodriguez, who'd been studying the same imagery, looked up with interest. Actually, Thompson might be onto something. The western approach does look less defended, but the terrain there is extremely challenging. You'd need someone with exceptional flying skills to navigate those peaks. And exceptional combat instincts to deal with what you'd encounter, Harrison added pointedly. This isn't a supply run, Thompson. This is a combat rescue in the most dangerous terrain we operate in. Blair bit back her response, knowing that arguing would only reinforce their perception of her as insubordinate. Instead, she quietly photographed the tactical display with her personal camera, memorizing details that might prove useful later. The western approach corridor was indeed treacherous, a narrow valley flanked by peaks that rose over 8,000 feet, with wind patterns that could slam an aircraft into a mountainside without warning. But Blair had flown through similar terrain dozens of times, had studied the meteorological data for this specific region, and knew that the same wind patterns that made the approach dangerous could also provide tactical advantages for a pilot who understood how to use them. After the briefing, she returned to her quarters and spread out her personal maps of the region. Using weather data from the past 6 months, she calculated optimal approach times based on wind patterns and visibility conditions. The western corridor would be flyable for approximately 45 minutes each day, a window that opened when afternoon thermal currents created predictable updrafts along the valley walls. More importantly, her analysis revealed something that the official intelligence reports had missed. The enemy's defensive positions were oriented toward the standard approach routes that military doctrine recommended. They weren't prepared for an attack that came from the west, threading between peaks that conventional wisdom considered too dangerous to attempt. Blair pulled out her personal flight logs and reviewed every mission she'd flown in this region. Transport runs, medical evacuations, supply deliveries. Each one had taught her something about the terrain that couldn't be learned from maps or briefings. She knew how the mountains channeled wind, how weather patterns developed in specific valleys, how to read terrain features that could hide an aircraft from enemy observation. As the afternoon wore on, reports from Devil's Canyon grew increasingly dire. Chen was alive but injured, trapped in his downed aircraft while enemy forces moved to consolidate their positions. Delta Team had managed to establish a defensive perimeter, but they were running low on ammunition and had wounded personnel who needed immediate medical evacuation. The rescue mission was being delayed while commanders debated approach strategies and waited for additional assets to arrive from other bases. Every hour of delay meant more time for enemy forces to strengthen their positions and less chance of a successful extraction. Blair stared at her maps, seeing a solution that no one would let her attempt.
The emergency briefing convened at 1400 hours in the main operations center, with every available pilot crowded around the tactical display. Blair found her usual spot near the back, notebook ready, though she already suspected how this would unfold. Colonel James Patterson, the base commander, stood at the front with the grim expression of a man weighing impossible choices. "Gentlemen," Patterson began, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of command, "we have a complex tactical situation developing in Devil's Canyon. Pilot Chen remains trapped in his aircraft, and Marine Recon Team Delta is pinned down by enemy fire. Intelligence estimates were facing coordinated resistance from approximately 200 hostile fighters positioned along the ridgelines." The room buzzed with tension as Patterson outlined the challenges. Multiple anti-aircraft positions, difficult terrain, and a narrow time window before enemy reinforcements could arrive from the surrounding region. Blair listened intently, mentally cataloging details that others seemed to overlook. "Sir," Morrison spoke up, "what about the western approach route? The terrain's challenging, but it might offer better tactical positioning." Patterson nodded toward the intelligence display. "Captain Walsh briefed us on that possibility. The western corridor is considered too dangerous for standard rescue operations. The flight path requires threading between peaks with minimal margin for error, and weather conditions in that sector are unpredictable." Blair raised her hand tentatively. "Sir, I've flown transport missions through that region extensively.
The weather patterns are actually quite predictable if you understand the thermal cycles. There's approximately a 45-minute window each afternoon when— Thompson, Major Harrison interrupted, his tone carrying familiar frustration. We've discussed this. Combat rescue operations require specialized training and combat-tested pilots. Your experience with supply runs doesn't translate to combat scenarios. But, sir, the tactical situation— The tactical situation, Colonel Patterson said firmly, requires pilots who have proven themselves under fire. Thompson, your dedication is noted, but this mission demands combat veterans who can make life-and-death decisions without hesitation. Blair felt the familiar sting of dismissal, made worse by the fact that she could see the solution clearly while experienced combat pilots struggled with approach strategies she'd already worked out in detail. Around the room, she caught the subtle exchanges of glances that reinforced the unspoken consensus: logistics personnel should stick to logistics. Captain Chen's wing leader, Morrison, shook his head as he studied the terrain maps. The standard approaches leave us exposed to too much ground fire. We need something unconventional, but I don't see any pilot-friendly options. What about a multi-bird approach, suggested Rodriguez. Coordinate simultaneous attacks from different vectors to split their defensive fire. That requires more aircraft than we currently have available. Our other Apache crews are committed to operations in adjacent sectors. We're looking at a minimum 6-hour delay for reinforcements. Blair knew that 6 hours was too long. Chen's radio transmissions were growing weaker, suggesting either equipment failure or deteriorating medical condition. The Marine team was reporting increased enemy probing attacks, indicating that hostile forces were preparing for a final assault. Time was the critical factor, and conventional solutions were eating up precious hours. She tried once more. Sir, if I could just explain the Western approach. Thompson, Harrison's voice carried a warning, you're out of line. This is a combat briefing for combat personnel. The dismissal was so casual, so automatic, that Blair wondered if Harrison even heard her suggestions or simply reflexively rejected anything she said. She'd encountered this pattern throughout her career, her ideas dismissed not because they lacked merit, but because they came from someone deemed unqualified to have combat-relevant opinions. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, who'd observed the exchange, leaned forward. Actually, Colonel, Thompson has more flight time over that terrain than any pilot in this room. Maybe we should hear her assessment. Patterson looked between Mitchell and Blair, clearly weighing political considerations against tactical needs. Thompson, you have 30 seconds. What's your assessment of the Western approach? Blair stepped forward, grateful for Mitchell's intervention, but knowing she had only one chance to make her case. Sir, the Western Corridor appears impassable on standard approach charts, but I've identified a flight path that uses thermal updrafts to provide both cover and tactical advantage. The enemy's defensive positions are oriented toward conventional approach routes. An attack from the west would catch them completely unprepared. And what happens when you encounter the inevitable ground fire from positions we haven't identified? Asked Harrison skeptically. The terrain provides multiple concealment options for a pilot familiar with the area. Ridgelines can mask approach routes, and valley features create opportunities for evasive maneuvering. Patterson studied her for a moment, then shook his head. Thompson, your analysis is thorough, but this mission requires proven combat capability. We can't risk losing another aircraft based on theoretical flight paths. The decision was final, delivered with the same polite firmness that had characterized every rejection of her capabilities. Blair returned to her position at the back of the room, watching as the combat pilots continued to debate approach strategies that she knew wouldn't work. As the briefing concluded with plans to wait for reinforcements, Blair realized that Chen and the Marine team didn't have 6 hours. They maybe had 2 before enemy forces overran their positions. Someone was going to have to prove that theoretical flight paths could save lives.
That evening, while her colleagues gathered in the officers' club to debate rescue strategies over beer and frustrated speculation, Blair retreated to her quarters with a different agenda. She spread her personal collection of terrain maps across her desk, each one annotated with months of careful observation and analysis that went far beyond anything required for transport missions. The Western approach to Devil's Canyon wasn't theoretical. She'd been studying it for 8 months, ever since she'd first flown supply missions through the adjacent valleys. What the intelligence reports classified as impassable terrain was actually a complex but navigable flight path that required precise timing and an intimate understanding of mountain flying techniques. Blair opened her personal laptop and accessed flight simulation software that she'd purchased with her own money. Unlike the basic combat simulators available on base, this program allowed her to input specific terrain data, weather conditions, and tactical scenarios. She'd spent hundreds of off-duty hours programming custom missions based on real intelligence reports, testing her skills against scenarios that might never occur but could prove crucial if they did. She input the current terrain data for Devil's Canyon using satellite imagery to create an accurate three-dimensional model of the target area. Enemy positions were marked based on the intelligence briefing, and she programmed defensive systems to simulate the anti-aircraft threat they'd be facing. The simulation wasn't perfect, but it was detailed enough to test approach strategies under conditions that closely matched the real situation. The first virtual approach confirmed what she already suspected. Standard attack profiles would expose any aircraft to devastating ground fire from multiple positions. The enemy had chosen their defensive positions well, creating overlapping fields of fire that covered all conventional approach routes. But the western corridor remained vulnerable, protected only by the assumption that no pilot would attempt such a dangerous approach. Blair ran the simulation 12 times, testing different entry points, varying altitude approaches, and alternative escape routes. Each run provided new data about optimal timing, wind compensation requirements, and tactical opportunities that existed nowhere in official planning documents. By midnight, she had developed a comprehensive flight plan that could deliver an Apache helicopter to the crash site with minimal exposure to enemy fire. But simulation was only part of her preparation. Blair opened a military surplus trunk that she'd kept hidden beneath her regulation gear, revealing equipment that she'd been quietly acquiring for months. Night vision goggles, advanced navigation systems, emergency medical supplies, and specialized communication gear, all purchased through legal channels but never reported because no one had asked what a logistics specialist might need for emergency situations. Her personal flight bag contained detailed weather data for the past 2 years, annotated with patterns specific to the mountain regions where they operated. She'd learned to read barometric pressure changes that predicted wind shifts, temperature variations that affected aircraft performance, and visibility patterns that could provide tactical advantages during specific times of day. Most importantly, Blair had been conducting unauthorized flight training during her off-duty hours. Using the base's flight simulator after normal operations ended, she'd practiced combat maneuvers that weren't part of her official training curriculum. High-speed terrain following, defensive evasive techniques, precision targeting under extreme conditions, all skills that combat pilots were supposed to learn during advanced training that she'd been never allowed to attend. Her personal notebook contained detailed analyses of every combat operation conducted in our theater during the past year. She'd studied after-action reports, casualty statistics, and tactical assessments to understand patterns that might predict enemy behavior. What others saw as excessive preparation, she understood as the foundation for making split-second decisions under pressure. Blair pulled out a specific map that she'd been working on for weeks, a hand-drawn tactical overlay of Devil's Canyon, combining satellite imagery, weather data, and intelligence reports into a comprehensive operational picture. Every potential approach route was marked with color-coded annotations indicating risk levels, optimal timing windows, and escape route options. The western approach that she had tried to explain during the briefing was marked in green, high difficulty but low risk if executed properly. She'd identified specific landmarks that could serve as navigation checkpoints, terrain features that would provide concealment during the approach, and wind patterns that could be exploited for tactical advantage. Her analysis showed something that the official intelligence assessment had missed.
The enemy's defensive positions were concentrated along sight lines that covered standard approach routes, but they'd left a gap in their coverage that could be exploited by a pilot willing to fly closer to the mountains than military doctrine typically recommended. As Blair reviewed her preparation materials, she realized that she possessed a unique combination of knowledge, skill, and equipment that might be exactly what the situation required. Months of hidden preparation had given her capabilities that even she hadn't fully understood until this moment. The question wasn't whether she could execute the rescue mission. Her analysis and preparation had already answered that. The question was whether she would have the courage to act when the moment came, knowing that success would validate everything she'd worked for, while failure might cost lives that others had deemed her unworthy to save. Blair closed her notebooks and began preparing for what might be the most important night of her military career.
The crisis escalated rapidly after midnight. Blair was awakened by the urgent wail of the base alert system, followed immediately by Major Harrison's voice over the facility-wide communication system. All personnel to emergency stations. We have multiple aircraft downed and Marines in immediate danger. Blair threw on her flight suit and rushed to the operations center, where she found chaos that made the afternoon briefing look calm by comparison. The main tactical display showed a nightmare scenario that had developed while most of the base slept. What had begun as a rescue mission for Chen and Delta Team had exploded into a full-scale crisis involving nearly 1,000 American military personnel. Colonel Patterson stood at the center of the command confusion, coordinating with multiple units as reports flooded in from the field. Bravo Company's helicopter went down attempting to reach Chen's position, he was explaining to someone on a secure radio link. Charlie Company tried a ground approach and walked into an ambush. We now have 847 Marines trapped in a valley system with no viable extraction route. Blair felt her blood turn cold as she absorbed the magnitude of the situation. What had started as a rescue mission for a downed pilot had become a disaster involving nearly an entire Marine battalion. The enemy had used Chen's helicopter as bait, drawing American forces into a carefully prepared kill zone. "Sir," Captain Walsh reported from the intelligence station, "satellite imagery shows enemy reinforcements moving into the area. We're looking at coordinated resistance from approximately 500 hostile fighters, including heavy weapons and anti-aircraft assets." The tactical situation was worse than anyone had imagined. The Marines were trapped in Devil's Canyon and 3 adjacent valleys, surrounded by enemy forces that had been planning this engagement for weeks. Standard rescue protocols had failed catastrophically, and conventional wisdom suggested that any further rescue attempts would only add to the casualty count. "What about the reinforcements from Stuttgart?" Patterson demanded. 6 hours minimum, came the reply from Major Harrison. "The weather system moving in from the Adriatic is grounding all flights from other bases." Blair studied the tactical display with growing horror and recognition. She knew every valley where Marines were trapped, had flown over the terrain dozens of times, and could see tactical opportunities that others were missing. But more importantly, she could see that waiting 6 hours for reinforcements would be too late. "Enemy forces are moving to consolidate their positions," Walsh reported. "Intelligence estimates they'll be in position for a final assault within 3 hours. After that, our people won't have defensive positions capable of holding until reinforcements arrive." The math was simple and brutal. 847 Marines needed immediate extraction from terrain that had already proven too dangerous for conventional rescue operations. Every aircraft that had attempted standard approach routes had been shot down or forced to withdraw under heavy fire. The enemy controlled the high ground, had prepared defensive positions for weeks, and possessed enough firepower to devastate any conventional rescue attempt. Blair watched experienced combat commanders struggle with a tactical puzzle that seemed to have no solution. They were trapped by their own doctrine, limited to conventional approaches that the enemy had anticipated and prepared for. The longer they debated, the stronger enemy positions became, and the slimmer the chances for successful extraction. "What if we wait for the weather to clear and coordinate a massive air assault?" suggested Morrison, who had returned from his earlier mission with battle damage to his aircraft. "The weather won't clear for 12 hours, Patterson replied grimly. "Our people don't have 12 hours." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell leaned over the tactical display, tracing potential approach routes with her finger. "Every standard route exposes our aircraft to multiple anti-aircraft positions. We need something unconventional, something they haven't prepared for." Blair felt her heart hammering as she realized that she was probably the only person in the room who knew what that unconventional approach might look like. The Western Corridor that she'd studied obsessively was still viable, still offered a way to reach the trapped Marines that the enemy hadn't anticipated. But she also knew that suggesting it again would result in the same dismissal she'd received earlier. Her analysis would be rejected not because it lacked merit, but because she lacked the combat credentials that command considered essential for mission planning. "Colonel," she said quietly, stepping forward despite knowing the likely response. "The Western approach." "Thompson," Harrison's voice carried exhaustion and frustration, "we've been through this. The Western Corridor is too dangerous for combat operations." "But sir, if conventional approaches aren't working, what's not working is the tactical situation, not our approach strategy. We need more firepower, not risky experiments." Blair looked around the room at faces filled with professional competence and growing desperation. They were good officers, experienced pilots, and dedicated military professionals. But they were also trapped by assumptions about what was possible and who was qualified to attempt the impossible. Somewhere in the mountains, 847 Marines were counting on these people to find a solution. Time was running out, and conventional wisdom was failing them. Blair made a decision that would change everything.
Blair stepped forward into the circle of senior officers, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. "Colonel Patterson, I request permission to attempt a rescue mission using the Western Approach Corridor." The command center fell silent, except for the static of radio communications from the field. Every eye in the room turned toward her, most filled with disbelief, others with the kind of patronizing patience reserved for well-meaning but misguided suggestions from junior personnel. Patterson studied her for a long moment, his weathered face showing the strain of commanding a crisis that seemed to have no good solutions. "Thompson, explain your assessment of the Western Corridor." Blair moved to the tactical display, grateful for the opportunity to present her analysis, but knowing she only had one chance to make her case. "Sir, satellite imagery shows enemy defensive positions concentrated along standard approach routes. They've prepared for conventional rescue attempts, but they've left the Western Corridor undefended because they assume it's impassable." She traced the route on the tactical map, pointing out specific terrain features that she'd studied for months. The flight path requires threading between mountain peaks, but thermal updrafts in this region create predictable wind patterns that can be exploited for both concealment and tactical advantage. Major Harrison shook his head before she finished speaking. "Thompson, you're talking about flying an Apache helicopter through terrain that's barely wide enough for a civilian aircraft, while under fire, carrying enough ordnance to engage multiple targets. That's not a rescue mission, that's suicide." "Sir, I've analyzed weather data for this region over the past 18 months. The wind patterns are predictable, and the terrain provides multiple concealment opportunities for a pilot familiar with mountain flying techniques." Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell leaned forward with interest. "What's your assessment of the tactical situation once you reach the target area?" Blair felt a surge of hope that at least someone was taking her seriously. "Ma'am, the Western approach would position an Apache helicopter behind enemy lines, allowing engagement of anti-aircraft positions from their undefended flank. It would also provide direct access to the trapped Marine positions without flying through the main defensive corridor." "And extraction?" Patterson asked. "How do you propose getting 847 Marines out of a valley that's surrounded by enemy forces?" "Create an exit corridor, sir. Use the Apache's firepower to neutralize defensive positions along a specific route, then coordinate with the Marines to move to predetermined extraction points where transport helicopters could land safely." The plan was ambitious, requiring precise timing and flawless execution. But Blair had worked out every detail during months of preparation that no one knew about. She could see the tactical solution clearly, could visualize how each phase would unfold, but she could also see the skepticism growing on the faces around her. Colonel Patterson exchanged glances with his senior staff, the kind of silent communication that occurred between experienced officers facing impossible decisions. "Thompson, your analysis is comprehensive, but this mission would require combat capabilities that you haven't demonstrated under fire." "Sir, I've logged more flight simulation hours than any pilot in this squadron. My targeting accuracy scores are consistently higher than—" "Simulation scores aren't combat experience, Thompson. We're talking about engaging enemy forces in close combat while providing fire support for nearly 1,000 Marines. That requires proven combat instincts and the ability to make lethal decisions under extreme pressure." Blair felt the familiar frustration building, but forced herself to remain professional. "Sir, with respect, someone's combat instincts haven't prevented this crisis from developing. Maybe it's time to try different instincts." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, and Blair immediately regretted the implication of criticism toward the combat pilots who'd been shot down earlier. But the words were out, and she could see Harrison's expression harden. "Thompson, you're out of line," Patterson said firmly. "Combat aviation requires more than theoretical knowledge and good intentions. It requires pilots who have proven themselves under fire, who can engage targets without hesitation when lives depend on it." "Sir, I understand the concern about my combat experience, but—" "No." Patterson's voice carried the finality of command decision. "Thompson, I appreciate your dedication and your analysis of the terrain, but I will not authorize a mission based on untested theories and flown by a pilot whose combat capabilities are unproven." Blair felt something cold settle in her stomach as she realized the conversation was over. "Sir, what if conventional approaches continue to fail? What if waiting for reinforcements means—" "Then we'll find another solution," Harrison interjected. "Thompson, return to your quarters. That's an order." The dismissal was absolute, delivered with the kind of authority that brooked no argument. Blair stood at attention, acknowledging the order, while her mind raced with the implications. 847 Marines were trapped in valleys she knew intimately, facing enemy forces that conventional rescue attempts couldn't overcome. As she turned to leave, Blair caught Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's eye. For just a moment, she saw something in the older officer's expression. Not agreement exactly, but understanding. Mitchell knew what it felt like to have capabilities that others couldn't see, to have solutions that authority figures wouldn't accept. "Thompson," Patterson called as she reached the door, "I want to be clear about something. You are not authorized to attempt any rescue operations. You are not to approach any aircraft without direct orders. You are to remain on base until this crisis is resolved. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Blair replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her mind. As she walked back to her quarters, Blair could hear the command staff continuing to debate strategies that she knew wouldn't work. They were good people, dedicated officers and experienced pilots, but they were also trapped by their own assumptions about what was possible and who was qualified to attempt the impossible.
The updates from the field grew increasingly desperate as the night wore on. Blair sat in her quarters, officially confined to base, but monitoring emergency frequencies through her personal radio equipment. What she heard painted a picture of a crisis spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Base, this is Granite Leader," came a transmission from the trapped Marine positions. "Enemy forces are moving to within 200 meters of our perimeter. We're taking heavy casualties and running low on ammunition. Request immediate extraction or resupply." The response from Base Command carried the strain of officers facing an impossible situation. "Granite Leader, be advised that reinforcements are en route but delayed by weather conditions. Hold your positions and prepare for extended defense."
Base, we can't hold these positions much longer. We have wounded personnel who need immediate medical evacuation and defensive positions that won't survive a concentrated assault. Blair checked her watch. 03:47 hours. The Marines had been trapped for over 6 hours, and enemy forces had used that time to strengthen their positions and prepare for what appeared to be a final assault. Every minute of delay meant fewer options for successful extraction and higher casualties when the inevitable attack came. Through her window, she could see activity around the flight line as ground crews prepared aircraft for missions that everyone knew were desperately needed but tactically unfeasible. 2 more rescue attempts had been launched and recalled after encountering heavy anti-aircraft fire. The enemy had created a perfect kill zone, and conventional rescue doctrine had no answer for it. Her radio crackled with another transmission that made her blood run cold. "Mayday! Mayday! This is Thunder Lead. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Repeat, we are going down." Rodriguez's voice, filled with the controlled panic of a pilot fighting for his life. Blair grabbed her binoculars and moved to her window, scanning the horizon for signs of the crash. Thunder Lead had been attempting another rescue mission using a modified approach that Command hoped might succeed where others had failed. "Base, this is Thunder 2. Thunder Lead is down approximately 2 miles northwest of the main enemy positions. I count at least 1 survivor, but the area is too hot for immediate extraction." Now they had another pilot down, another aircraft destroyed, and an even more complex tactical situation. The enemy had demonstrated that they could defeat any conventional rescue attempt, and each failure strengthened their position while weakening American forces. Blair returned to her radio as reports continued to flood in from the field. Intelligence updates showed enemy reinforcements arriving from surrounding regions, indicating that hostile forces had been planning this engagement for weeks. They'd used Chen's original helicopter crash as bait to draw American forces into a carefully prepared ambush zone. "All units be advised," came an update from Captain Walsh in the Intelligence Center. "Satellite imagery shows approximately 800 enemy fighters now in position around the trapped Marine units. They appear to be preparing for a coordinated assault on all defensive positions." 800 enemy fighters against 847 trapped Marines with limited ammunition and no air support. The math was simple and brutal. Without immediate intervention, the situation would become a massacre rather than a rescue operation. Blair listened to the command frequency as senior officers debated increasingly desperate options. Artillery support was impossible due to the proximity of friendly forces to enemy positions. Airstrikes would risk hitting American personnel. Ground reinforcements couldn't reach the area before enemy forces launched their assault. "Colonel, we need to consider the possibility that conventional rescue operations aren't viable. Maybe it's time to evaluate unconventional approaches, such as..." Patterson's response carried the exhaustion of a commander running out of options. "The Western Corridor approach that Thompson proposed. I know it's risky, but our conventional options have all failed." Blair felt her heart skip as she heard her plan being discussed again. But Harrison's response was immediate and negative. "Frank, that corridor is a death trap for any pilot who attempts it. Thompson's analysis might be thorough, but it's still theoretical. We can't risk another aircraft on untested theories." "Frank, we've already lost 3 aircraft using tested approaches. Maybe theoretical is better than repeatedly failed." The debate continued, but Blair could hear the underlying reality in their voices. They were trapped by their own doctrine, unable to approve a mission that fell outside established parameters, even when established parameters were proving catastrophically inadequate. At 04:12 hours, the radio brought news that changed everything. "Base, this is Granite Leader. Enemy forces are beginning their assault on our positions. We are taking heavy fire from all directions. This is not a probing attack. This is their main assault." The final battle had begun. 847 Marines were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, with no air support, limited ammunition, and no prospect of conventional rescue. In approximately 2 hours, enemy forces would overrun American positions unless someone found a way to change the tactical equation. Blair stood up and walked to her equipment locker. She'd heard enough debates about what was impossible and enough updates about deteriorating situations. Somewhere in those mountains, American Marines were dying while experienced officers argued about acceptable risk levels and proven combat capabilities. It was time to prove that acceptable risk was whatever it took to bring everyone home.
Blair stared at her reflection in the small mirror above her wash basin, seeing the face of someone who had reached the moment that would define her entire military career. Outside her window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern mountains, casting long shadows across the base that reminded her of the terrain where 847 Marines were fighting for their lives. The radio updates had grown increasingly desperate over the past hour. Enemy forces were pressing their assault from multiple directions, and the Marine defensive positions were beginning to collapse under concentrated fire. Captain Rodriguez, the latest pilot shot down, was reportedly wounded and trapped in his aircraft while enemy forces moved to capture or kill him. Blair opened her personal equipment locker and began laying out gear that she'd been quietly acquiring for months. Night vision equipment, specialized navigation systems, emergency medical supplies, and detailed maps annotated with information that existed nowhere in official military databases. Every piece of equipment represented preparation for a moment that she'd hoped would never come, but had always known was possible. Her personal radio crackled with an update that crystallized her decision. "Base, this is Granite Leader. We are down to less than 30 minutes of ammunition. Enemy forces are within 50 meters of our positions. If extraction doesn't happen immediately, we're going to be overrun." 30 minutes. That was how long 847 Marines had before enemy forces overwhelmed their defenses and turned a rescue situation into a massacre. Blair checked her watch. 0445 hours. In conventional military planning, 30 minutes wasn't enough time to coordinate a rescue mission, let alone execute one. But Blair's plan didn't require coordination or approval. It required one Apache helicopter, one pilot willing to fly through terrain that others considered impossible, and the kind of precise execution that came from months of obsessive preparation. She reached for her personal phone and scrolled to a contact that she'd never expected to use, Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell's private number. Mitchell had been the only senior officer to show genuine interest in her Western Corridor analysis, and Blair sensed that the older woman understood what it felt like to have capabilities that others couldn't see. The phone rang twice before Mitchell answered, her voice alert despite the early hour. "Thompson? What's wrong?" "Ma'am, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you believe my analysis of the Western Corridor approach is tactically sound?" There was a pause, and Blair could hear the weight of the question settling. "Thompson, where are you calling from?" "Ma'am, do you believe the approach could work?" Another pause, longer this time. "Yes," Mitchell said quietly. "I think your analysis is probably correct. I think you've identified a tactical opportunity that our conventional approach strategies have missed. And do you believe that waiting for reinforcements will save those Marines?" "Thompson, what are you planning?" Blair looked at her equipment laid out on the bed, then at the tactical maps that showed terrain she knew better than any pilot on the base. "Ma'am, I'm planning to prove that being emotionally invested in the outcome doesn't make someone weak. It makes them strong enough to do what others won't attempt." "Thompson, listen to me carefully. You are not authorized for combat operations. If you attempt an unauthorized mission, it will end your military career regardless of the outcome. Ma'am, with respect, if I don't attempt this mission, there won't be any Marines left to have careers to worry about." Mitchell's voice carried a mixture of admiration and concern. "Thompson, even if your analysis is correct, you'd be flying alone into a combat zone with no backup and no official support. If something goes wrong, then I'll have failed attempting to save 847 lives instead of succeeding at following orders that guarantee their deaths." The line went quiet for a long moment. When Mitchell spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thompson, I can't officially authorize what you're thinking about doing, but I can tell you that I've spent 20 years in this military watching good people die because someone decided that following protocol was more important than saving lives. Ma'am, I understand the risks and the consequences, but I also understand that those Marines don't have time for protocol." "If you do this," Mitchell said, "you will be completely on your own.
Command will disavow any knowledge of your actions, and you'll face court-martial regardless of the outcome. Ma'am, I understand, ma'am. Thompson, be careful, and bring our people home. The line went dead, leaving Blair alone with her decision and the equipment that would either save hundreds of lives or end her military career. She began putting on her flight suit, each piece of gear representing a commitment to action that couldn't be undone. As she prepared to leave her quarters, Blair took one last look at the letter she'd written to her sister months ago, explaining why some things were worth any risk. She'd never sent that letter, but tonight she understood why she'd written it. Some decisions couldn't be made by committee or approved by authority figures who prioritized acceptable risk over acceptable outcomes. Some decisions required someone willing to prove that impossible was just another word for untested. Blair shouldered her equipment bag and headed toward the flight line, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether she was remembered as the pilot who saved 847 Marines or the one who died trying.
The pre-dawn darkness provided perfect cover as Blair made her way across the base toward the flight line. Security patrols were focused on perimeter defense and monitoring for potential threats, not watching for unauthorized personnel movements within the base itself. She'd timed her approach to coincide with shift changes, using blind spots in the security coverage that she'd observed during months of early morning supply runs. Apache Helicopter 172847 sat in the maintenance area, recently serviced and fully armed with a standard combat load, 30mm chain gun with 1,200 rounds, 16 Hellfire missiles, and electronic warfare systems that could jam enemy communications. Blair had specifically chosen this aircraft because she'd overseen its maintenance cycle and knew every system was operating at peak efficiency. The hangar was empty except for a single maintenance technician completing overnight inspections on a different aircraft. Blair waited until he moved to the far side of the hangar, then slipped through the side entrance and approached her target helicopter. Her maintenance credentials gave her legitimate access to the aircraft, and her flight gear made her presence appear routine to any casual observer. She completed her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency, checking systems that she knew were already perfect, but following procedures that had been drilled into her through years of training. Hydraulics, electrical systems, weapons targeting, communication equipment, every component that would determine whether her unauthorized mission succeeded or failed. As she powered up the Apache systems, Blair felt the familiar thrill of advanced military technology responding to her commands. The helicopter's twin engines spun up with a whisper-quiet precision that reminded her why these machines were considered the most lethal aircraft in the sky. She was about to find out if months of preparation had made her worthy of commanding such devastating capability. Her personal radio crackled with another update from the field that reinforced the urgency of her decision. "Base, this is Granite Leader. Enemy forces have breached our outer perimeter. We are falling back to final defensive positions. Estimate 15 minutes before we're completely overrun." 15 minutes. Blair had planned for this contingency, had calculated flight times and tactical approaches based on the assumption that she would be operating under extreme time pressure. The Western Corridor approach would take 12 minutes to reach the combat zone, leaving her a narrow window to engage enemy positions before the Marine defenses collapsed entirely. She activated the Apache's navigation systems and input coordinates for waypoints that she'd memorized months ago. The flight path would take her through mountain passes that barely appeared on standard aviation charts, using terrain features for concealment while approaching the enemy's undefended flank. As the helicopter lifted off, Blair switched to emergency frequencies to monitor the developing battle. The radio chatter painted a picture of desperate fighting as Marines struggled to hold positions against overwhelming odds. She could hear the controlled panic in their voices, the kind of professional calm that came from soldiers who knew they were probably going to die, but were determined to make their deaths count. "This is Thunder 2, still circling the area but unable to provide effective fire support. Enemy anti-aircraft positions have us pinned down at altitude.
We can see friendly positions being overrun, but can't get close enough to engage." Blair smiled grimly as she guided her Apache through the first mountain pass. Thunder 2 was trapped by conventional doctrine that required maintaining safe distances from anti-aircraft threats. Her approach would bring her close enough to enemy positions to use the Apache's weapons with devastating precision, but it would also expose her to ground fire that could destroy her aircraft in seconds. The terrain was even more challenging than her simulations had suggested. Wind patterns between the mountain peaks created turbulence that required constant adjustments to maintain stable flight. Visibility was limited by the narrow valleys and early morning shadows that could hide terrain features until she was dangerously close to them. But Blair had prepared for these conditions, had studied weather data and practiced navigation techniques that allowed her to fly by instrument reference when visual cues were inadequate. Every training session, every hour spent memorizing terrain maps, every simulation run was paying off as she threaded through passes that conventional wisdom said were impassable. At 05:02 hours, her navigation system indicated that she was approaching the final waypoint before entering the combat zone. Ahead of her lay the most dangerous part of the entire mission, emerging from the concealment of the mountain passes and engaging enemy forces that had been preparing for this battle for weeks. Blair checked her weapon systems one final time, ensuring that targeting computers were calibrated and missile guidance systems were online. In approximately 3 minutes, she would discover whether months of unauthorized preparation had made her capable of saving 847 Marines, or whether she was about to become another casualty of a crisis that had already claimed too many lives. The radio crackled with another update from the field that made her blood run cold. "Base, this is Granite Leader. We are being overrun. I repeat, we are being overrun. Enemy forces are in our positions. This will be our final transmission." Blair pushed her Apache to maximum speed, racing against time to reach Marines who had just seconds left before enemy forces completed their assault. The unauthorized rescue mission had become a race against annihilation, and everything depended on whether one underestimated pilot could prove that impossible wasn't permanent.
Blair emerged from the mountain pass at 05:04 hours to find a battlefield that exceeded even her worst-case scenario planning. Devil's Canyon stretched below her like a vision of military hell, with muzzle flashes lighting up the pre-dawn darkness as 847 Marines fought their final battle against overwhelming odds. Enemy positions dotted the ridgelines exactly as intelligence reports had indicated, but seeing them through her Apache's targeting system revealed the true scope of the tactical challenge. Heavy machine gun nests, anti-aircraft positions, and mortar teams were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that had turned the valley into a death trap. But Blair's Western approach had achieved complete tactical surprise. Her helicopter emerged behind enemy lines, invisible to defensive positions that were oriented toward conventional approach routes. For the first time in 8 hours, American forces had an advantage in the battle for Devil's Canyon. "Unknown aircraft, identify yourself immediately," came an urgent transmission from Base Command. "You are not authorized for combat operations in this sector." Blair switched off her radio and focused on the targeting display that showed enemy positions in perfect detail. She had perhaps 30 seconds before hostile forces realized they were under attack from an unexpected direction. After that, every anti-aircraft system in the valley would be hunting her. Her first target was a heavy machine gun position that had been devastating Marine defensive lines. Blair brought the Apache into a shallow dive, using terrain features for concealment while her targeting computer locked on to the enemy position. The 30mm chain gun spoke with lethal precision, sending 150 rounds into the machine gun nest and eliminating the crew in seconds. The explosion of the first target created immediate chaos among enemy forces. Soldiers who had been focused on assaulting Marine positions suddenly found themselves under attack from behind, caught between American ground forces and an Apache helicopter that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. Blair banked hard left, using a ridgeline for cover as anti-aircraft missiles began streaking past her cockpit. The enemy response was immediate and coordinated, indicating the kind of professional military training that made them dangerous opponents. But their positioning had been optimized for engaging threats from the east, and Blair's western approach left them exposed and vulnerable. Her second target was an anti-aircraft position that posed the greatest threat to her continued survival. Blair brought the Apache into a diving turn that would have been impossible without her intimate knowledge of local wind patterns. The maneuver brought her helicopter below the expected flight path, allowing her to engage the SAM launcher before its crew could achieve target lock. 2 Hellfire missiles left their launch rails with perfect precision, destroying the anti-aircraft position in a fireball that lit up the entire valley. The explosion triggered secondary detonations as stored missiles cooked off, creating a chain reaction that eliminated 3 adjacent defensive positions. But the engagement had also revealed her position to every enemy soldier in the canyon. Automatic weapons fire began converging on her aircraft from multiple directions, forcing Blair into evasive maneuvers that tested every skill she'd developed during months of unauthorized training. She rolled the Apache inverted and dove toward the canyon floor, using the helicopter's agility to avoid the streams of tracer fire that painted deadly patterns across the sky. Her flight path took her between mountain peaks with only meters of clearance, following routes that she'd memorized during countless hours of terrain study. "Granite Leader, this is Unknown Angel. I'm engaging enemy positions on your perimeter, prepared to advance when I give the signal." The response came immediately, filled with disbelief and desperate hope. "Unknown Angel, where the hell did you come from? We thought we were dead." "Not today," Blair replied, bringing her Apache around for another attack run. "I'm going to clear your escape route. When I tell you to move, take your people northeast toward grid reference 748. Transportation will be waiting." Blair had no idea if transportation would actually be waiting, but she had calculated that her combat actions would force Base Command to launch immediate rescue operations regardless of their previous reluctance. Success would create its own authorization. Her third target was a mortar position that had been raining high-explosive shells on Marine defensive positions. Blair approached from an angle that used morning shadows for concealment, emerging from cover only long enough to engage with her chain gun. The mortar crew was eliminated before they realized they were under attack. Each successful engagement shifted the tactical balance further in favor of American forces. Enemy commanders who had been coordinating a final assault suddenly found themselves fighting a defensive battle against an Apache helicopter that seemed to anticipate their every move. Blair's knowledge of the terrain allowed her to use ridgelines, valleys, and wind patterns for tactical advantage in ways that enemy forces couldn't predict or counter. She wasn't just flying a combat mission, she was conducting a masterpiece of tactical aviation that combined months of preparation with split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. As she prepared for her fourth attack run, Blair realized that the impossible had become inevitable. The battle for Devil's Canyon was turning, and 847 Marines were going to live to see another day. The tactical situation in Devil's Canyon shifted dramatically as Blair's Apache helicopter carved through enemy positions with surgical precision. What had begun as a desperate last stand for 847 trapped Marines was transforming into a coordinated breakout operation that would be studied in military academies for decades. Blair's fourth attack run targeted the command position that had been coordinating enemy fire. Her intelligence analysis had identified the location based on communication patterns observed during previous battles, and her precision strike eliminated the enemy's ability to coordinate defensive responses. Without central command, hostile forces began fighting as isolated units rather than a cohesive military force. "Unknown Angel, this is Granite Leader," came the transmission from the Marine positions. "Enemy fire is decreasing significantly. Whatever you're doing up there, keep doing it." "Roger, Granite Leader. Beginning final clearance of your escape route. Prepare to move in 2 minutes."
Blair brought her Apache into the most dangerous maneuver of the entire mission, a low-level attack run directly through the valley that would eliminate remaining anti-aircraft positions but expose her to concentrated ground fire from every remaining enemy soldier. The flight path required threading between terrain features while engaging multiple targets in rapid succession. Her targeting computer identified 6 high-priority threats along the planned escape route. Blair engaged them in order of tactical importance, using a combination of Hellfire missiles and chain gunfire to eliminate defensive positions that could threaten Marine movement. Each successful strike opened another section of the escape corridor, creating a path that ground forces could use to reach safety. The enemy response was immediate and desperate. Realizing that their carefully prepared ambush was being dismantled by a single helicopter, hostile forces concentrated their remaining firepower on Blair's aircraft. Automatic weapons fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and shoulder-fired missiles created a deadly pattern across the sky that forced her into evasive maneuvers that pushed both helicopter and pilot to their absolute limits. Blair rolled inverted and dove toward the canyon floor, using a technique she'd practiced hundreds of times in simulation but never attempted in actual combat. The maneuver brought her Apache below the trajectory of most incoming fire while positioning her for a devastating attack on the largest remaining enemy concentration. Her chain gun spoke with lethal authority, sending 300 rounds into a defensive position that had been pinning down an entire Marine company. The enemy position disintegrated under the concentrated fire, eliminating the last significant obstacle between trapped Marines and their escape route. "Granite Leader, your path is clear," Blair transmitted. "Move your people northeast to grid reference 748. You have approximately 15 minutes before enemy reinforcements arrive." The Marine response was immediate and professional. "Unknown Angel, we are moving. All units break contact and move to extraction point. Unknown Angel, who are you?" Blair smiled grimly as she brought her Apache around for overwatch duties. "Just someone who believes that impossible isn't permanent." As Marine units began their coordinated withdrawal, Blair monitored enemy communications frequencies to track hostile force movements. Her electronic warfare systems were jamming enemy radio networks, preventing coordination of pursuit operations and buying precious time for the extraction to succeed. Her fuel gauge showed that she was approaching the limits of safe operation, but Blair calculated that she had enough remaining flight time to provide cover for the Marine withdrawal and conduct her own escape through the western corridor. The return flight would be even more dangerous than the approach, as enemy forces now knew her capabilities and would be prepared for her exit route. At 05:47 a.m., transport helicopters appeared on the horizon, responding to emergency calls that Base Command had finally authorized after Blair's combat success made conventional rescue operations possible. The cavalry was arriving, but only because one unauthorized pilot had proven that the impossible rescue could work. "Unknown Angel, this is Thunderlead," came a transmission from the incoming rescue flights. "We have multiple transport birds inbound for extraction. Request you maintain overwatch until our people are clear." "Roger, Thunderlead. I'll cover the extraction until everyone's out." Blair climbed to altitude and established a protective pattern pilot that would allow her to engage any enemy forces that threatened the rescue operation. Her ammunition was running low, but she still had enough firepower to discourage pursuit operations while transport helicopters loaded casualties and personnel. As she watched Marine units reaching the extraction point and boarding rescue aircraft, Blair felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication. 847 American military personnel were going home safely because someone had been willing to prove that impossible wasn't permanent. The last transport helicopter lifted off at 05:12 hours, carrying the final group of Marines to safety. Blair's unauthorized rescue mission had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations, transforming a military disaster into a tactical victory that would save hundreds of lives and careers. Now she just had to get herself home and face the consequences of proving that impossible wasn't permanent.
The flight back to Ramstein Air Base took Blair through the same mountain passes she'd navigated in darkness hours earlier, but everything had changed. Her radio crackled with transmissions from base command, search and rescue operations, and medical evacuation flights, all coordinated around the rescue mission that everyone had said was impossible. Apache 172847, this is Ramstein Control, came the formal transmission as she approached base airspace. You are ordered to land immediately and report to base command. Colonel Patterson requests your immediate presence in the operations center. Blair acknowledged the transmission with professional calm, though her heart was hammering with the knowledge that she was about to face consequences that could end her military career. She'd succeeded in saving 847 Marines, but she'd also violated direct orders, stolen military equipment, and conducted unauthorized combat operations that broke numerous regulations. As her Apache touched down on the flight line, Blair could see a crowd gathered near the operations center. Word of her unauthorized rescue mission had spread throughout the base, and personnel from every unit had assembled to witness the aftermath. Some faces showed admiration, others displayed curiosity, but all eyes were focused on the pilot who had accomplished what experienced combat veterans had deemed impossible. "Thompson," Colonel Patterson said as she approached, his voice carrying the weight of command authority, "you are under arrest for violation of direct orders, unauthorized use of military equipment, and conducting combat operations without proper authorization." Blair stood at attention, accepting the formal charges with the same professional demeanor she'd maintained throughout her career. "Yes, sir. I understand the charges and accept responsibility for my actions." "However," Colonel Patterson continued, his tone shifting slightly, "before we proceed with disciplinary actions, I need to understand exactly what happened in Devil's Canyon. Your unauthorized mission appears to have achieved tactical objectives that our conventional approaches could not accomplish." The debriefing that followed lasted 3 hours and involved officers from multiple commands who wanted to understand how a single pilot had succeeded where entire squadrons had failed. Blair presented her tactical analysis, explained her months of preparation, and described the execution of combat maneuvers that would be incorporated into Apache pilot training programs. "Thompson," Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell said during the questioning, "your combat effectiveness scores this morning exceed anything we've seen from pilots with years of combat experience. How do you explain performance levels that surpass trained combat veterans?" Blair's answer was simple and honest. "Ma'am, I was emotionally invested in the outcome. When you care that much about bringing people home safely, it makes you more precise, more determined, and more willing to attempt maneuvers that others consider too risky." The room fell silent as senior officers absorbed the implications of her statement. The emotional engagement that had been considered her greatest weakness had proven to be her greatest strength, enabling tactical performance that surpassed conventional military training. 6 hours after landing, Blair was summoned to Colonel Patterson's office for a private meeting that would determine her future in military aviation. She expected court-martial proceedings, disciplinary action, and the end of her flying career. Instead, Colonel Patterson offered Blair a choice that changed everything. "Thompson, your actions this morning violated numerous regulations and military protocols. Under normal circumstances, you would face severe disciplinary action, including possible discharge from military service." Blair prepared herself for the inevitable consequences of her unauthorized actions. "However," Patterson continued, "your tactical success has demonstrated capabilities that this command cannot afford to lose. You are being transferred immediately to the 1st Special Operations Wing, where your unique combination of skills and initiative will be properly utilized." The words hit Blair like a physical shock. Not punishment, but promotion. Not discharge, but recognition of abilities that had finally been acknowledged by military leadership. You'll be leading a new Apache squadron specifically tasked with impossible rescue operations in hostile terrain. Your methods will become doctrine, and your tactical innovations will be taught to every Apache pilot in the European theater. 6 months later, Blair stood in the same briefing room where she'd once been dismissed as too emotional for combat operations. But now she wore the insignia of squadron leader, and when she spoke about tactical approaches, everyone listened with the respect reserved for proven combat veterans. The key to success in hostile terrain, she told her assembled pilots, is understanding that being emotionally invested in the outcome doesn't make you weak. It makes you dangerous. Her squadron had completed 12 impossible rescue missions, saving over 200 American personnel from situations that conventional wisdom deemed hopeless. Each success reinforced the lesson that Blair had learned during her unauthorized flight to Devil's Canyon. Impossible wasn't permanent, and sometimes the most underestimated warrior becomes the most dangerous. The woman they'd once called too emotional to fly combat missions had become the pilot that everyone wanted covering their extraction when everything went wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.